Well, thanks everybody for coming today. My name is Jack Clabby. I'm with Carlton Fields. We have two very experienced and expert panelists today. First, we have Michael Ritchie, who's from Germinal Resources. Michael's been in the technology field for, I think, 25 years now, and now owns and operates a software consultancy that makes this sort of thing we're going to be talking about today. His experience is in medtech, it's in fintech, it's in e-commerce, and pretty much anything you can think of he's touched on in his more than 2 decades of doing this sort of work. His clients include Veralytic, Moffitt Cancer Center, and UPS. So, Michael, thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And my partner, Eleanor Yost, is also is experienced and has done this for many years. Is experienced both in counseling companies in dealing with either their own intellectual property in the form of software code or dealing with contracting or disputes between them and their vendors. And she's done everything from startup companies through to Fortune 100 companies, both on the counseling side and the litigation side. So I'm really happy that she's going to be here to answer everyone's questions and to talk to us a bit about that today. So just to kind of get us started, Eleanor and Michael, why is this a hot topic? What can go wrong here? What's so exciting about this today?
Typically, the software development contracts come from the vendor to the customer, and the customer is unaware or doesn't have good counsel on the legal side and on the project management engineering side. It can all be in the vendor's favor, and so the result is largely put on whether the vendor decides to do a good job or not. The contract itself actually can reinforce not only legal protections for you if you have a good form contract, but also it can reinforce good engineering practices, which will give the project a much better outcome.
So I think that beautiful relationship, right, the legal and the technical, has to go together. And what we're going to do for our presentation is start out with 2 particular war stories, one from the public sector, one from the private sector. I like starting with stories because besides having the enjoyment of seeing colossal failures in this space and hopefully talking a little bit about how to avoid those failures, it's also more interesting to watch a relationship from the start through when everything implodes to see how they got there, because it's never just we drafted the contract and it wasn't so good, or we didn't really get the technical specs right. It's always a confluence of events, and then there's things that happen beyond the parties who are involved that also typically impact these relationships. And the first one we're going to talk about actually has to do with Massachusetts. So come with me way back to the heady days of 2006. So Massachusetts, back in 2006, now this is Mitt Romney's the governor, Cars 1 is out in theaters, this is, you know, back in the day, was dealing with an unemployment claim software system that was coming up on about 30 years old. This thing was a monster. Poor folks who were trying to put in their claims weren't getting paid. They'd sit on the phone. The folks from the state who worked on the system were constantly just trying to keep it like an old car functioning on a daily basis. And then finally, during the Romney administration, and then for many, many years after, which we'll talk about, they decided, all right, we're going to upgrade this thing. We're going to bring it up to date. We're going to have something that functions better. So Massachusetts puts this contract out for bid. And they hire a relatively small software development company from McLean, Virginia, which is actually where I, up until about 6 months ago, used to live. So now they're happy. Okay, we got this great company. They're going to start working on it. 2 years later, boom, they're out of business. They're bankrupt. The company's gone. It's blinked out of existence. Massachusetts now has nothing. They have money out the door and no system, so they have to regroup. So they put the contract out to bid again. And now this time, Deloitte is the low bidder. They had several people bid for the contract, ended up granting it to Deloitte. So this particular system was not a massive system for the state at the time. It was several $1 million, but there were other systems that Deloitte was working on for 40 other states that were well above $100 million. So what happened here? Clearly we know, since we're talking about it, that not everything worked out very well for these poor folks. Beginning with what the end result was. Deloitte was contracted to deliver the system in 2001 in July. They blew through that date and delivered nothing. Another year goes by. Now we're in March of 2012. They still have nothing to deliver. The state's getting a little worked up. State has now paid them close to $4 or $5 million, has zero results. Now they're getting outside pressure. Folks are asking questions. Watchdog groups are writing letters. Things are getting a little heated. So the state goes back to Deloitte and basically says, all right, what do we need to do here? And Deloitte says, you need to pay us $5 million more and give us an extra year and a half or so. Now, the state, of course, freaks out. This is not what they planned for. So they turn to the contract. And this is why this particular story is great for what we're trying to do here. So they need to get the backstop. What does it say in the contract? What do these guys owe us? Do we have to pay them? And it turns out, no, the contract was not written very well, and including having absolutely no penalty whatsoever for blowing through now multiple years of delivery dates. In other words, just like if you were building a house, right, you might have a per-day penalty that you would charge your GC if he's not delivering your home. There was nothing like that in this contract. In addition, they realized that Deloitte actually owned the software under the contract, not the state. So the state actually had no access to it up to that point. And then there were several other issues in the contract that Mike will talk about in a little bit, including the fact that the state was unable to reasonably test the software over time. In other words, the contract said, okay, when we finish something, maybe it's a module, you, Massachusetts, have 10 days to come, check it out, and if it's all good, then we'll keep going. But if you, Massachusetts, because you're a giant bureaucracy, fail to show up in 10 days and do nothing, it's automatically accepted and we get to move on.
That's very common in tech contracts, is when you'll have multiple milestones within the project that the vendor has to meet, and then they'll have a period where you can either reject their delivery or you automatically accept it by not doing anything in those 10 days. Most customers do not know what to do in those 10 days. They're not prepared to test the software, and they're not prepared to respond to it if it didn't function. So that's all in the vendor's favor when it's written that way, and so they usually just get to skate through those periods, fixing a few minor bugs, and carry on. The other interesting thing about this case was when the software was finally resolved and delivered, it didn't actually function well. And this system replaced an existing 30-year system, and it had to do everything the existing system did, and it had new functionality, not just updated interface for the state. But it wouldn't meet the same specifications as the old one. It wouldn't function. A lot of people didn't get paid that were on the welfare rolls, and so they almost had to pull the plug on the whole system. And this could have easily been fixed if the contract had stated that the project was done in phases and that they would use test-driven development where each phase had to meet a certain number of tests to be complete and move on to the next phase. The sad thing about this system is they didn't need to generate test data. They had previous data. They had all the people that were on the payroll, say, for the last year, and they had the payouts for them. That's the minimum testing you should have done at each phase of the system to see if it was functioning. But because the customer, being the state, wasn't prepared to deal with that, it just rolled on and was never a fully functional system until they had to, get legal action at the end.
Was this a big bang cutover where there was like one day where you're allowed to switch and use it?
Pretty much, yes, which is also a very big mistake.
So what ended up happening in the end was Massachusetts had a decision to make, right? So they could fire these guys and go with someone else, or they could kind of put up with this, we need a ton more money and a lot more time to finish it. Ultimately, in this particular case, they decided to pay the ton more money and get Deloitte to finish it. Why that's really interesting is it got a ton of publicity. It was front page of the Boston Globe. Now you imagine the poor administrators who are working for the state who have, 300 of these projects going at any one time are just getting all this heat on this one relatively small project. At the same time, Deloitte was working for Massachusetts on a completely separate system for the school district, which was actually up at $140 million, I think. Something incredibly similar happened. $55 million into the contract, the state's not getting what they want. Oh, I'm sorry. It was their tax revenue system. The state finds out that the tax revenue system Deloitte is building for them can't print anything and can't calculate interests and penalties for folks, which the state rightfully thought, we kind of need to be able to do that with our tax system. So instead of doing what they did here, they fired Deloitte in that contract and just cut them loose and got someone else to do it. Now, neither of those outcomes are what we want for you, which is why we're going to talk a little bit about how we can avoid that stuff. But you can see that a lot of these issues will come up both in the public sector and in the private sector. And we're going to talk quickly about a case that I call the Mr. Computer case, because that's actually what the case was called, which makes me love it immediately because it has a great case name. So this is actually a lawsuit. So the other one ended up with a lot of fights, but this one has a very long and tortured procedural history that we won't get into, but the timeline helps explain what we're talking about here. So we have a client, they're called AMS, so they're a marketing company essentially, and they work for insurance companies. They hired Mr. Computer himself. That's actually what he went by. That was his DBA. His name was Kevin, so we're going to call him Kevin. So Kevin had a very small software development company, and 95% of the work he did was for this marketing company, AMS. So Kevin, back in 1999, starts working for AMS. They don't really have a particularly formal relationship. There's no long, detailed contract about what Mr. Computer here is doing for AMS. They just kind of send him purchase orders, for lack of a better term, say, please, can you work on this for us? And it was very fluid. Kevin would work with the group, and then he'd go, and then he'd work some more, but he was not employed. Eventually, about roughly a year later, Kevin decides that he's going to get his act together and get his little company a formal contract with AMS. So he gives them, on his letterhead, what they called a technical services agreement. So we don't have a ton of information about what was in this agreement, except the most important provision, which the Ninth Circuit, who actually decided this case, said essentially that AMS hired Mr. Computer here, Kevin, to provide some custom application programming with specific add-on products to enhance AMS's current in-house database application, and that's it. No discussion of ownership, no discussion of a timeline, no discussion of anything, essentially, other than, hey, we have a relationship and we're going to send you requests and you're going to deliver. That's it. There was nothing else. That particular contract was a one-year term. That term came, that term went, everyone sort of forgot that it even existed. Now, in the meantime, Mr. Computer is developing programs for AMS and delivering them, and everything's fine. The folks are happy. Nobody's complaining about his work product. He actually gets himself several employees. His little consulting business is growing. Things are working out well. All of a sudden, AMS says, oh, we want to get our act together on the compliance side, so someone suggests that they send Mr. Computer a non-disclosure agreement. So the non-disclosure agreement is fairly standard, except, oddly enough, it contained a very long IP ownership provision in it, which is very unusual. You wouldn't stick that in an NDA. It makes very little sense contractually why that would appear there. So it was 4 paragraphs long, and what it said was, you, Mr. Computer, everything you do for us, AMS, guess what? We own it right down to the source code. AMS, in the lawsuit, presents this NDA 6 months into the case to the court and said, oh, by the way, look what we found. Mr. Computer signed this thing, and we own everything that he did for us. Mr. Computer, at this point, probably because he's caught, right, says, no, 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 this is a forgery. I never signed this. The document doesn't exist. AMS created this and is using it to sway you, judge. So now we know this thing, all hell's going to break loose, right? So this guy's accusing the lawyers of making up documents. AMS is saying this guy is a scam artist, and he, we paid him really well to do all this great work for us. Now things are really rolling, but that happened later. Back when the NDA was signed or forged, we don't know. Kevin comes back and decides, all right, now we're really going to get our act together, and proposes an outside vendor agreement, whatever that is. It basically is a meaningless title to some agreement where Kevin is trying to actually lock down the fact that he wants to own all the software that he's developing for AMS. So that agreement has those provisions in it. Basically says, me, Mr. Computer, I develop all this stuff, everything I own, mine, hands off AMS. But by the way, you can keep paying me to develop all of this software that only works with your databases, don't mind that. And then he goes so far as to put his trademark, Mr. Computer, on the splash page of every piece of software he delivers to AMS. Nobody, by the way, at AMS is complaining at all about this. They're not even thinking about it. The folks who take delivery just want the thing to work, right? So they don't care whose name is on it and anything else that's put on that splash page. So anyway, long story short, they present this outside vendor agreement. AMS looks at it and says, hey, wait a minute, you don't own everything. That's not cool. Let me redline it. So they give it to one of the lawyers. The lawyer deletes all the ownership provisions out of it, inserts a whole lot of ownership provisions in favor of the company. Kevin, Mr. Computer, says, haha, no way. Starts screaming bloody murder at them. AMS then says, fine, and fires him. All right? Basically terminates their relationship. AMS, though, very quickly realizes that they have no idea where the software that he gave them is actually located. Nobody's ever asked the guy. It may or may not be on their systems, but, oh crap, somebody needs it now, and we've just actually really pissed this poor guy off. So they go back to him, and he says, yeah, no way. We're going to go back and fix that agreement that we tried to negotiate and give all the ownership back to me. AMS now realizes they're in trouble. All right? These programs are absolutely necessary to running their business. All of their databases are now keyed off of these things. AMS says, fine, well, you know what, Kevin? We don't need you. They go behind his back and hire out from under him every single employee of his consulting company. And they leave Kevin by himself. So now all of Kevin's employees, who are getting paid a heck of a lot more money, go over to AMS, and AMS says, great, now that we've hired all you guys, and you know that guy Kevin, he's a pain in our ass, we want you guys to find the software that he gave us. And actually what they did find was that in at least certain environments, Kevin had uploaded some source code to AMS's servers. Kevin, now lonely in his office, rightfully freaks out, and then the all-out war begins. So there's a massive lawsuit, claims, counterclaims, trade secret claims, ownership claims, license claims, back and forth, back and forth. We ultimately end up before the Ninth Circuit. So we're on appeal. You have to imagine millions of dollars have now gone into this lawsuit. Years have gone by. AMS is still not entirely sure where all the software is. And all they know is now they're paying a lot of money to fight this guy because they truly believe that, hey, we paid him to develop the software for us, for our databases, and we don't have it, and it's ours. Court, give it to us. We really, really need it. The court plays Solomon and splits the baby. And the reason they do this is because of those agreements we talked about, the red lines that were never signed, the crazy forged NDA. The court says, listen, I don't have a contract that tells me, AMS, that you own all of this IP. You never signed anything that said that. And all Kevin's got is this TSA from way back in the day that basically suggests he owns it. But we understand. You paid something, you thought it was yours, it took you a long time to find the source code that was on your system. You get a license. You get a non-exclusive license, but you can keep using it, which is honestly, at the end of the day, what AMS needed to do. They wanted to keep using it. But at the end of the day, Mr. Computer, Kevin, crazy forgery guy, was vested with ownership of all this stuff that he developed for this company. He got paid a lot of money. He still owns it, which means he turns around the next day and calls up competitor of AMS and says, let me tell you about some great software I got that's going to make your business better. So I realize that was an incredibly long timeline, but you can see how what starts out as a very typical relationship where you hire a small company who does great work with a few employees suddenly, over the course of just 3 or 4 years, becomes such a massive multi-million-dollar mess that the company almost stops functioning because they didn't have the right to use their stuff.
That's right. The crux of this story is, obviously, they should have had better contracts in place when they were doing business with him, especially as it grown over the years to protect themselves. But The way software is actually built is it's written in a language, and then we call that source code, and then it goes through a process called a compile or a build, and that's the software that you run on your computer. If you have a copy of Microsoft Word, you're getting the compiled copy from Microsoft. You can't make changes to that because you don't have the source code. All that's up in Redmond in Microsoft's office. They're not going to let you have it. When you contract for custom software development, the contract needs to state that you own that source code, and then it has to be delivered at each of the milestones so that you have possession of that. So the contract should have that, but then practically, as the client, you should have in-house expertise or hire a third party to verify that what they're giving you in source code is what's being delivered, and you have possession of it. The interesting part of this story is they would have still had the same disagreements all along the road that they had by not having a contract, but if they had verified they had possession of the source code, he would have not have had any leverage, right? And for him to dispute that, he would have had to sue the company that they were using his software. In this case, he never gave him access to the source code. When there was a dispute, he withheld it. He had all the leverage, and they had to sue him to get possession of it. So it's a lot about leverage. So you have to do that due diligence and not only have it in your contract, but have someone on your side to verify you're getting what's delivered to you.
So we've seen from these examples, we've seen 3 different vendors, right? In the Massachusetts example, the first vendor who immediately goes belly up. And then we have Deloitte, right, which is a name that's common to anyone who's in this industry. And a significant number of problems that run from that, right? You might not have known by contracting with someone that's a household name. In Mr. Computer example, we have Kevin, right, who's doing great work, but maybe doesn't have the apparatus that's making it sophisticated to predict and to resolve in an inexpensive way, right, where these problems come up. You can contract for some of these, and we'll talk about that. But at the beginning, at the outset, if you're a customer for custom software, what are some of the things you need to think about in evaluating a vendor?
So there's no legal agency that oversees who can build software. It just doesn't exist. Now, a couple of states have started a software engineering license. Texas has one. Florida actually has one. But in practical use, it's not part of the industry. It's just too new. So it's probably about 20 years out before those type of licenses are going to be involved in software development. Anybody can call themselves a software developer, and anyone can go out and sell their services as a software developer. So really, you've got to rely on references and look back on the references and their body of work. And depending on the size of the project, you need some in-house expertise or advice on whether or not this person's qualified for what they're doing. The other thing to consider is where they came from, right? So are you satisfied with the security of this person coming in and writing your software for you? If you hire a network administrator or someone to write software that's a core part of your business, they have access to all of your data, all of your billing, all of your customer, all of your communications potentially. They have access to that. So you got to think about what's the due diligence of doing this. If you hire somebody to make changes to your website, they're working with content that's public. So maybe you just need a couple references on that. But if you hire somebody to work on your core systems or on your core network, you need to do a background check on this person. You need to do multiple levels of checking because the risk is very great. If you hired a bookkeeper, you might do a background check. If you hired a CTO, you do a lot more work. A network administrator or your software developer of a key system is that CTO level. He has access to everything potentially.
What about, so Michael, on the one hand, you've got the security and the reputation and whether this person who has admin access, right, whether they're going to rip me off, or they're going to do something wrong. But what about the other aspect of security, right? You have a well-meaning vendor who checks out with all this stuff. How do you ensure their processes are secure?
That's a good point. You could have an honest, well-meaning vendor who has poor processes internally, and they can put you at risk. So depending on what type of data you're dealing with, say HIPAA data, there are compliance laws that they have to comply with and you have to comply with. So you want to look for a vendor who has experience in the area that you're working with. But also, that's where you need a little in-house expertise to go in and look at their processes and make sure that they are keeping control of your data and not exposing you to risk just from being incompetent at what they do, even though they may be honest people. what happens very frequently in software development projects where you're working with existing data is they'll come in and make a copy of your data because that's what they're going to work off of, and then they'll work off of that. A lot of times that's not necessary. So you should ask that question at the very beginning of the process when you're writing the contract and proposing the project is, do you really need a copy of my data, and do you need it for the entire time? The other thing that can happen is even if you do need a copy of the data, you can de-identify it. You can go in and make changes to some of the fields in the data to where it's essentially useless if someone were to steal it. So that's what you're looking for from the vendor, is not just for them to verbally say that they're following these processes, but you want to do a little due diligence and look at their company, visit, ask questions to see if they really have a good process set up and they're having control of that. If you know that there's going to be ongoing maintenance with the software, which there almost always is with custom software, you want to talk about that during the first contract, even though it may be a separate contract, the ongoing. You definitely want to talk to him about that, what the rates are going to be, what type of guarantees he gives up front. But it's essential when you develop custom software is that part of the delivery is not just the source code, but documentation and code comments and build scripts so that you can take that project to a different vendor or hire people in-house to run that project. That needs to be part of deliverables to protect yourself.
In a lot of these scenarios, when you're hiring a custom software vendor, the vendor is going to use subcontractors yourself to complete the project. If you've put in the right protection between as to the customer and the vendor, how do you know that's going to pass through so that the subcontractors don't make a claim for the IP?
So the NDA and the rights part of the contract should require them to make sure that you have full license to what's delivered for you, and it should require them to maintain confidentiality on any internal data that they look at, and then it rolls downhill to them. In some situations, if they're thinking of offshoring the development, you may have situations where you have patient data or financial data that you don't want to go offshore. Therefore, you would eliminate that in the contract. It has to be done all by onshore contractors. But you're putting the responsibility, NDA rolls downhill, if I'm correct. You're putting the responsibility on them. Therefore, they have to put it down on their vendors. So you should state that in the contract. The interesting part about who owns the software is modern software is actually built by pieces, right? So the guy who built this building didn't manufacture that door. He bought that door from another company, and he assembled it on this. Modern software is built that way. You start with an operating system like Windows. You're going to work on Windows or in a web browser, and you build on top of that, and you buy components and pieces and assemble it. Otherwise, every custom software project would be really, really huge in price. So part of the contract needs to be that the vendor supplies you with all the licenses or makes you aware of the ongoing licenses that are required to use the software that you have. And it actually should have 4 sections in it. And Eleanor can speak to the details of this better. He needs to say that anything that he develops for you is a work for hire and that you have full license to it. It has to have another section that says if he reuses any code that he owns, that he had before he come to work for you, that he assigns you full rights to that code. So if I have something I bring in from another project that I wrote, I assign full rights to you. I need to have a section that says if I license anything, I need to make you aware of it and pass those licenses down to you. So when I deliver the product, now you own the license and not me, because it's part of the project. And then the 4th thing is any digital assets that are used, graphics files and those things, I have to deliver those to you. And also, if they come from a third party, I need to deliver the license for those to you. And in fact, with graphics files, because they're covered under copyright, abusing those when you lose a lawsuit with that can actually be much more than abusing the copy of the software itself. The penalty can be huge.
Connor's question is about whether there's issues with the third-party licenses. If some portion of the code that passed through to your project as the buyer really was subject to either an imperfect license or a license that didn't allow that sort of use, how do you address that?
Yes, and that can be the case. In fact, a lot of software development tools, instead of licensing the use, the components that are used to build the software, they license the developer by annual subscription. So for you to use it, he can't just pass it on to you every time. Sometimes you have to go out and pay for that subscription for your developer, or the next vendor has to pay for that subscription. So you should be aware of that. And so your contract should say, some of these decisions are made during the project, so it's really hard to define it all at the beginning. But your contract should say that you should be made aware of those, and you have to sign off on them as part of a milestone. That way, you know what you're buying as you go through the process, and then if it's an ongoing subscription or something you have to do yourself, you're not caught at the end.
These were the problems with the Deloitte contract that Eleanor talked about at the beginning. So Eleanor, maybe let's try to build this house, right? So what are some of the things you should think about when you're getting this contract ready and putting it together?
So we're going to talk a little bit about the ownership issues and then how in the contract to protect yourself beyond, we're going to talk about work for hire and assignments, but then also warranties, which is how you go after your, let's call them the prime developer, if they've failed to police their subs, which is also incredibly important, and we'll get to that in a second. But before we get to the dispute, what we want to do is show you how to hopefully never get to the dispute. So let's back up. So what agreements should we be thinking about, at least initially, right? In addition to your specific assignment, which we'll talk about in a second. But to build the actual product, and as a lawyer, I hate saying this because I'm going to tell you my agreements are the most important, and my agreements are not the most important. They're never the most important. My agreements that I draft for you are the backstop. Mine are everything else has fallen apart, and we don't know what to do, and we don't know what our remedy is, and we are now completely unable to resolve our dispute with our contractee. What do we do? And then you refer to the legal agreements. But I think what Mike can help explain to us as far as functional specifications, what do we need to do initially before we're even signing that agreement to develop that in a way where the contractor is going to get what they're seeking.
An example I like to use a lot when I'm talking to potential clients is they'll say, "What does it cost to build X?" And I say, that's like asking me what it costs to build a house, right? Well, how big is the house? How many bedrooms does it have? How many bathrooms? How many kitchens? Does it have a pool? That determines what it's going to cost to build your house. And where we build it will determine how much it costs to build your house. Software is the same way. You have to define what you're going to build, at least to a point to where the vendor can give you a decent estimate or a guaranteed price on that. You have to define that up front. A lot of times when you go to a software company to do custom software, they will actually propose that you do an hourly consulting agreement up front where you define this functional specification. Sometimes customers are a little afraid of that because they go, oh, that's just an open-ended engagement where I'm going to get billed a lot and I haven't, no software is going to get billed. But actually that's a very important part of the process, is deciding what we're going to build before we try to put a price on everything for the long haul. So those functional specifications up front is the engineering name for it, is where you say this is what the system does and this is how we're going to build it. And then the vendor can give you a much better price and also build a project and engineer that system at a much more guaranteed rate based on those functional specifications.
Once you've done that first part, though, what are some of the ways that payment can come in? Are there different options?
There are different options for that. I'm a big fan of doing milestones within the software development project. It keeps both sides honest. So you break the payments out into multiple points in the project, and each milestone will have a delivery. It'll have a piece of the project that has to be done by the vendor, and it will also have some work on the customer side to validate that that piece is done, and then that payment's made. And it works very well on both sides. That also gives you nice points where if you have situations where, in the Massachusetts example, any new software system is a creative work. It's never been built before, right? So the reason a road system costs so much is because you're asking this construction company to tell you how to build something that's never been built before. We've never built a road from here directly to Tallahassee, so they just put a big price on it, right? So software is the same way. If you build new software, you're building something that's never been built before. Otherwise, you would just buy it. And this allows, breaking it into pieces gives you nice points to where if the vendor realizes he was way off on his agreement, or that you realize, oh, we really didn't define out what we want the software to be very well, it's a nice point to say, hold on, can we renegotiate this? Because we're at a milestone, we both know where we're at, and maybe we need to renegotiate this, because most contracts come down to negotiation. If a vendor is way behind, like we had with the Deloitte situation, you can put the legal crunch on them and say you have to deliver this, but the chances of you getting a quality product out of that, if they're really behind, is really bad. So that's why the state decided to give them more money, even though it was a lot. That's why they did that. So those milestones with deliveries and payments keeps everybody on track and honest, but also gives you a point to say, hold on, we're both really off track here. Let's think about how we're approaching this, and maybe either cancel the project or renegotiate it to something that works better for both sides.
So I'd also want to bring up change orders, which particularly in the public sector is something that just it's going to happen. It's 100% going to happen. I actually don't know of any of my clients' contracts where that wasn't an issue. And for folks working with budgets, particularly if you're on the public side, right? You're working for an agency, state, federal, whatever it is. I have my bucket of money. This is what is authorized. I am not a private sector, someone who can just pick up the phone and get another check cut for you, vendor. This is how much I have released to me. And those change orders become completely unruly. So in that Deloitte example, what actually ended happening over the course of that contract was, remember now, in 2008, 2009, the number of folks who were suddenly thrust into the unemployment system in Massachusetts shot up like they had never experienced before. So if you think at it from a practical perspective, the folks who were spending a whole heck of a lot of time trying to supervise Deloitte and what was going on suddenly needed to be redeployed for reasons that had nothing to do with this project to come help basically man the phones and get the forms in because they were suddenly inundated, right? So now you have Deloitte, who I've been picking on them all day. I'll say something good for them, who says, okay, well, we're coming up on our milestone and we're ready. We want to test this thing. You got to give us your data. And now the state's going, I don't have a guy that can just sit and make the data for you. Everybody's flat out working on this other thing. So what ended up happening was they had to be a little bit more flexible, and actually some money went into it. But those negotiations, honestly, the best ththing to do is accepting that they are likely to happen makes them less adversarial. Immediately coming back and saying, you blew through your date, and now we're just going to fight. I don't think anybody at the end of the day is going to either get the product they want or have the relationship they need to be able to negotiate effectively to keep that price down, but also deliver the product that's going to satisfy your requirements.
You've got some talk about timing for these things and hitting milestones, but that's assuming that what you're getting on these milestones is right. Now, if I'm building a road to Tallahassee, right, I don't get a warranty necessarily on that road. What is the availability of warranties for custom software?
That's really negotiated because it can be all over the place, but you're going to be charged for that, right? If you demand you support this for a year and anything that goes wrong, the vendor's going to consider that in his price. I mean, that's just the reality of it. If you know you're going to have ongoing services with the vendor, sometimes the warranty period it's more beneficial to you to do it very shortly. So let's say the first 60 days they're going to warranty it and fix any bugs in it. But if you know you're going to be going into a phase where they're going to make ongoing changes to the system for you, then keep that warranty phase short. That gives you a chance to find if they have some really deficient areas and they have to fix them on their dollar. But then go right into that maintenance phase where you're paying them to make the changes and corrections that you need ongoing with the software. That tends to be more approachable to the vendor. And it would work better for the client.
So just to add on that, what I think people don't realize, and this is really helpful if you're the customer, is that not all of the warranties need to have the same time limit on them. And I'll give you an example. We were talking about basically title and non-infringement, right? So your vendor has various subcontractors. You've told them, you need to tell me all of the licenses you're using. You need to give me, I'm going to have title. Let's just say, for example, I'm going to have the rights to do what I want with this software, and there can be a warranty for that built into the contract. So if that is breached, either because the subs were not, I would call it flow down because that's a public sector term, but if your prime developer does not flow down that requirement to their subs, that they give you clean title, then you have a warranty built into your contract with your prime that might be a significantly longer duration than the very short warranty of just the functionality. So that I might not find out that my license isn't good for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, but I really also need, my vendor wants me to figure out that there's a problem with the system, which is a separate issue. So your warranty provisions can be covering a whole host of different things under different timelines. And those are all negotiable as well. So when you come to the table and say, okay, Prime, you're telling me that you're going to hire 25 subs, I don't like that. It makes me nervous, right? I don't think you can manage those 25 subs. So what you have to give me in return, you can hire those 25 subs. You have to flow down these requirements that I get the license that I want or the clean title that I want, and then you're going to warrant that for a fair amount of time so that if it actually does come to my attention, I have someone I can sue, right? So if you're not in privity with the subcontractors, or they're in India, or they disappear, or their McLean software developer goes bankrupt and there's nobody to go after, you need somebody to be on the hook, and it's usually your main developer to do that.
Eleanor, for these disputes that you're talking about, right? Mr. Computer and Deloitte, these are expensive. They're in court, and court's going on and on. But is court your only option?
No. So you can also build in dispute resolution in the contract. We saw in the Mr. Computer case, that was actually a federal district court case, and that went up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And you have to imagine the millions of dollars that went into that dispute. It went on forever. But if that's not what you want to do and you want to go straight to mediation or arbitration, that's something that you'd want to build into your original contract and not try to force who's now your opponent, your counterparty, into that after the dispute's already arisen, right? So in the Mr. Computer case, they hated each other at that point, right? Mr. Computer is saying, you're forging documents, and then of course the companies, you're stealing my employees. They want to see them die just to see them dead, right? They don't want to do anything that would seem like they were bending for the other side. So building in the, hey, if we're in Massachusetts and we're in Deloitte, you know what, we're going to have a mediation. It's going to be in Boston. It's going to be before this set of mediators. We're going to build that in when everyone still is happy and joyful. And that way you're probably going to get it in the contract without much dispute, because honestly, those provisions, when you're building them in, are the least important to most of the parties. Most folks say, yeah, okay, I'll go to Massachusetts. I don't care that I'm a Florida company. We're never going to fight. And, you know, you do fight, and it's suddenly you realize you're in arbitration in Massachusetts when you don't want to be. But it's one of the provisions that if you don't want to have that enormous cost on the other side for maybe a contract that's only $1 million, right? So you build it in early, and then you just kind of sticks around for the duration.
I'm a big proponent of binding arbitration as your dispute resolution in your contract, but you got to be aware that you give up your right to go to court if you do that. But what binding arbitration does is encourages you to work something out before you even get to binding arbitration, because in the end, you're going to both present your sides and someone's going to make a decision. So it behooves you to work out the dispute. You know, going back to the construction analogy, you know, software guys like to use construction analogies because it fits so well. If you built half of a building and you decided the vendor wasn't going to cut it anymore and you fired him, good luck finding another vendor who's going to pick that up, right? The next guy who comes in who's going to take that over is probably going to charge you 80% of what the original contract was just to pick it up. Software is the same way. You don't want to have to drop it in the middle. If you get into a major dispute in the middle, if you can, it's best to work it out. And binding arbitration reinforces that, right? We can't get mad and start suing each other if the contract specifies that that's taken off the plate, that it's going to be arbitrated by an independent either board or individual, and the dispute's going to be made. So that makes us go back and say, let's work something out at least to get to the end of this contract, and then you can find a new vendor after that. But it basically keeps everybody calm down and working with each other.
Yeah, Rod.
Do most of the contracts have an injunction provision in them? I mean, what happened in Mr. Computer, for instance? Did AMS not, they weren't able to operate during the course of the litigation, or?
So they couldn't make changes because they didn't know where the source code was. And that was their big problem. So they eventually found the source code, which is just a bizarre fact that it was sitting in their own system. But what they really wanted to do was go in and Mr. Computer, there's been other cases like this where the actual developer locks everything up So you can't even add new customers. Like when they get really mad, they lock, and then the poor folks who are just working on the system can't do it. So they were out of luck, though, because they had so many claims back and forth, including crazy trade secret stuff. It wasn't a cut and dry, let me run and get an injunction quick. You show up to the court where everyone has 800 pages worth of claims. Suddenly the court says, I don't know what's going on here, but preliminary relief seems like a really bad idea when there's so much bad blood on both sides. So those guys, unfortunately, had their hands tied for a long, long time.
Right, so part of your deliverable needs to be everything required to build your software and to put it in production. And that includes documentation and instructions on how to build it, and the source code, and the documentation and the comments in the code that allows a new set of developers to come in and work on it if that's necessary. I had a client a couple years ago, about 5 years ago, they had me go in and do an audit of an existing company where I went in and looked at what their processes were, their engineering practices, and gave them recommendations where they could improve. They had outsourced their entire development for 8 years to a company in Minsk. And it had went very well. They had built them software, it worked, they did it at a very good price, the company was making money, but they were starting to up their price, and so that's why they brought me in to look at what they were working on and see what situation we're in. They didn't have control of any of their source code. They were only delivered the compiled product, so they couldn't just take off and replace that vendor. And one of the things they said was, and remember this is 5 years ago, they go, yeah, but we have great relationships with them, and the relations between America and Russia are great, so we don't see any problems. Well, what's happened in those 5 years, right? Could we be cut off from offshore development and not have access to the source code? That could happen.
How does the contract create this ownership? Like, how does it resolve it in advance? What role does the NDA play in that? What role does the assignment play in that? How does that work?
So that's a great question. So there's several agreements that usually pop up over the course of the relationship. The ownership provisions, which we'll talk about in a second, are ultimately just parts of the bigger contract. The NDA usually comes first. This is when you're first talking to the potential vendor and trying to explain to them what it is that you want. And that's really, frankly, to protect the entity that's asking for the work to be done, because they want to give the vendor certain, perhaps confidential information and then say, okay, vendor, maybe the vendor's doing a demo, maybe the vendor's doing a mock-up, maybe the vendor's giving a very detailed proposal. So you don't want that vendor then taking your ideas and then your information, wrapping it all up and sending it to your competitor, right? After they put in all of that great pitch work and they didn't get chosen. You certainly don't want them advertising that they can do this now. The ownership is really important, and there's exactly one thing that I want everyone to take away from this talk today, and we've used the term today a little loosely, and that's work for hire. So I'm going to put on my intellectual property nerd hat and explain to you why work for hire is almost never what it is that you're looking for. Work for hire comes from the copyright law. Okay, so copyright law is in the Constitution. There's a body of law around it. Work for hire was designed for employees. Okay, so you're an employee of Carlton Fields, you're an employee of Michael, you're an employee of whomever, and I hire you and you're my employee and I hired you maybe to develop software. So Carlton Fields has a nice big IT group, they do some development work sometimes. Those folks within the scope of their employment are performing certain functions. Work for hire applies to them. Work for hire does not apply to independent contractors. Does not. Here's why. There's a lot of reasons that I will not get into because you will all fall asleep and say, forget it, I don't understand this at all. The copyright law specifically says that work for hire applies to independent contractors in a very small set of circumstances. There's actually 6. One of them is developing an atlas, if you can believe that. Another one is developing tests, so the folks you hire to write the SAT questions. Another one is developing the answers to tests, so the folks who come up with the answers to the SAT. Those are 3 out of the 6, okay? So you can imagine these are very, very specific. Software is not one of them. How do we get ownership of the software we're developing from an independent contractor, right, not an employee, to the person who's hiring them? We do that through an assignment. And what ended up happening is lawyers, business people, folks who look at past agreements and say, well, I don't really know if it applies here or not. I'm not totally sure. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll belt and suspenders the whole thing, and I'll put everything I can into this agreement. I'll have work for hire. I'll have assignments. I'll have all these different things. It's not necessary, number one, if you have someone who knows what they're talking about, draft your agreement. But it's hard because we use the phrase work for hire in a colloquial way and not a technical way. So you'll see agreements where you have these two provisions. These are very actually not specific provisions. They're not good provisions. Please don't use these provisions. But what they're trying to do is, okay, if it's not a work for hire, well then you assign it to me anyway. And all right, that's fine. But the work for hire stuff gets to be dangerous in some cases, and I'll give you one example. These are actually the how you get an independent contractor to be a work for hire. If you say that an independent contractor's work for you is a work for hire, in California, it could mean that you need to treat them like an employee, which is horrible. You don't want to do that. You're just hiring this guy to develop software for you. All of a sudden, I have employment obligations that I had no idea about. It's not a common thing. But why take the risk, right? So the idea here is I'm not going to teach you how to draft a contract like you're going to go and figure this all out on your own. The point being, if I'm going to carefully delineate the ownership of the software that's being developed among the people who are parties to the contract, I'm going to get the person who knows what they're talking about to write those provisions for me. Because why take the risk? We saw in Mr. Computer that nobody did that at all, and Mr. Computer tried to do it, and then it utterly failed. And then finally, when people saw, wait a minute, nobody ever decided this issue, they had dueling forms back and forth. I own everything, you own everything. Nobody knows who owns anything at that point. At the end of the day, what we want to see is for folks who want completely custom solutions, they want title, but that's not always the result that is necessary or even desirable. And as Mike was saying, we build systems, frankly, rarely from the ground up. Rarely. So if you're the client and you want a system built, it's not always the case where you have to put your foot down and say, I own everything that's coming out of this relationship. And again, we were talking about warranties that can be broken up to have varying scopes. Same thing with the title. So you can say, this particular module, which is being built from the ground up, is mine. I own it. You're going to assign me the title. We're going to be really specific about that. But there may be other pieces to that puzzle that Mike can talk about where you're taking a license because it's somebody else's. But what you need to do is be careful about your rights to those licenses. And that's where the warranties come in, where I need to be able to do my requirements. I need to, this thing needs to function the way I need it to function. And I need to make changes without getting in trouble and having somebody that I never heard of sue me. How do I accomplish that? And it's actually breaking the project down rather than sort of taking that holistic, I own it, you own it, we're not really sure who owns it approach.
Yeah, one of the key things to take from what she was just talking about is if you don't have in your contract who owns it, and it's not quite this simple, but if the software developer writes it, the person who actually wrote it, he has the copyright by default. Until you get into the situations can flow down from that, right? So if your contract doesn't state it, he owns it. So he needs to assign that copyright to you in the case. The other thing I want to point out, and then I'll get into some of the specific types of software that can come to you, is if you try to tighten down your contract to where everything is in your favor and it really clamps down on the developer, very likely the vendor will say no thanks, right? I've had contracts presented to me where they went to legal on the other side, they come back and it basically was written where, well, we're in the insurance industry, you can't do any work for anybody else in the insurance industry. And I said, no thanks, that's too big of a fish for me to just to let go, right, just for this one project. So we had to roll it back to where their trade secrets is what I, protected, not my ability to go out and work within the same industry. So when you get down to the licenses, it's better to have the contract state that they are required to give you or inform you of all the licenses of the components that your software is built with or on top of that you need to run your software. That way it's back on them. So if somebody comes up later on and says, hey, your software contains something that I wrote that I own, you're back on that vendor. It's their responsibility because they were supposed to give that to you. So if there's $10,000 owed for license on that, it's back on them. The other thing to consider before we take a question is when you're using small vendors is, do they have anything to take if they fall apart, right? So if they steal somebody's software and give it to you, and then you find out later on, if you go back to them and they don't have any money or any insurance, there's nothing you can do about it.
So it sounds like in being an operator of a company, you can look at ownership in three ways. If the employees are internal, that's where you use the concept of work for hire. So if you have a lab, they're signing some kind of employment NDA that says that anything you do here is work for hire and we own it. So we set that aside. Then the interesting distinction is if you're doing a development contract with an outside independent consultant, that's when you use assignment.
Right.
When there's a third scenario when you purchase a company, like an asset purchase. So if you're doing an asset purchase, in that area, it's not work for hire. Maybe it's assignment, but is it just really in the reps and warranties of what they're representing, they're selling you? Is that how you do the ownership protection?
So that's how I protect myself, right? It's again, the actual asset purchase itself is going to have an assignment component. So it's just a special type of assignment, really. So it's company A assigns their rights into the software to company B for purchase price, right? So it's again an assignment, but the struggle is knowing, does company A own what it's telling me it owns, right? Did it do everything it needed to do with its employees? So there's a whole host of folks who we work with here who sit and do the due diligence, right? So they're looking at those employment agreements. So the employment agreements assign their rights. Did they have the contracts in place? Did they go out and have some independent contractors? So it's unfortunately a detailed work to figure out the answer. And for folks who decide, look, I'm not going to spend $100,000 on lawyers to do this due diligence, they'll go back into the actual reps and warranties itself and say, you're representing to me or warranting that you own this, and then if not, here's money in escrow, here's some other remedy that I'm going to go and be able to take advantage of if that doesn't work, when the question is not clear in that respect.
So we've talked a lot about the software licensing and so on, but one thing I imagine, and I'm wondering if you have any advice on this, that's happening more often is now the software is in the cloud, kind of running there, and the vendor might have set this up, and I think AMS was probably lucky that cloud didn't exist then, because they might not be around their servers. Do you have any advice for what vendors should do when that's the case? That should be in the contracts?
Well, a lot of times these decisions are made, like where the software is going to be built and what services it will need, is made during the project. So in that case, one of the first milestones needs to be to define all of that and deliver it to you, and the customer has to approve it. So if I build your system to run on the AWS Amazon cloud, and you have to have a subscription up there, and the reasonable prediction is it'll cost $12,000 a year to maintain it there, I need to make you aware of that, and you need to sign off on that to accept that, so that you can carry on and take care of the system as you go forward. Another point that ties right into what you're asking is, when the project is over, when things are built in the cloud, where it's running is not a system that's locally, where your local system administrators set up and have control of, do they have control of everything it takes to run that software application when the project is over? Or does the vendor really still have all the admin passwords and all the secret information it takes to make that run? Do they still have that? You need to have that at the end of the contract. And you're either in-house system administration or a third party that's advising you needs to verify that you have that. Otherwise, you can't fire the vendor because they have the keys to everything.
What are the things that you need? Like, what's that list of what are some of those deliverables that the vendor should expect to give and that the customer should expect to receive, so that there's true ownership?
Well, we've already talked about the source code and the documentation. So beyond that, you need to have administrative passwords and access to all your systems, whether they're in-house and local or if they're in the cloud. You also need to be aware of those licenses like we talked about previously. What's it going to cost me to keep this up and keep it going? okay? And you need to have possession of that. For any system of significant size, I would say don't just get a copy of the source code at the end. Actually, you get the whole repository. And so that's a little bit in the technical weeds, but you need to know that I need to own not just my software source code, but all the changes that happen to source code. That's in the repository, and so you need to own that at the end, so that you have possession of that.
Is there we want to talk about regulations and standards now. Is there anything before we leave ownership that we didn't talk about that we might want to mention?
Actually, there was one more minor issue, and that's when you only get that license and not the ownership. And maybe that's fine with you. But the question always becomes, what happens if my licensor goes out of business like we saw in that company in McLean? What if they blink out of existence, right? You guys are supporting my work. What do I need to do? In some instances, some people recommend that you have your vendor, if you're paying them enough, put their code in escrow so that if things go bad, the escrow agreement that you would enter into would be triggered. Maybe that company goes bankrupt. And then you would actually have access to the software you need to keep doing what it is you're doing. Other folks say that's just overkill, you're spending money for no reason. I think there's, of course, a gradient, right? That if you are going to stop operating on day one of this company's bankruptcy, then I think you need to consider spending the money to have stuff in escrow, where you need to ramp it back up as quick as you can, or else that you're just going to be losing a massive amount of time, money, whatever it is, on a daily basis.
A good alternative to that is this. Source code is not stored like a Word document on a drive. It's actually stored in what's called a source code repository. You can actually have the vendor use your source code repository from the get-go, from the very beginning of the project. And if the vendor says, oh, we only use, the vendors mostly license the use of another source code repository in the cloud, you can just create an account on the vendor that they like to use, but you have the code and you own the account that it's in from the very beginning. And so rather than have it in escrow, you always have possession of it during the process, and at the milestones when it's delivered, it's yours because it's in your account. And so that's a good median for that. And the way most vendors work these days, there's not much of a reason for them to refuse that if you ask for it.
We license a lot of software and work with a lot of startups.
Mm-hmm.
We've been using Iron Mountain to actually escrow their code in favor of us. What you're talking about right here gets around that whole mess.
Yes, because you have the code in your, it's basically like saying all the files that you're editing, they're on my server. They're in my account, right, that I have at the source control company. It's my account. I'll give you access to it. You're making changes to it, but at any time, I already have it. It's in my possession, and I have it.
I gotta get you started.
But I have to point out that the vendor, now remember, for vendors, this is their crown jewels, right? So what are you giving me, if I'm the vendor, to give you the keys to my kingdom, right? And that's either money or the contract is that important to me, something along those lines. But imagine your most important trade secrets to your organization. If your client, your customer is saying, okay, well, I want you to take your most important trade secrets and then put them into this closet in my building. What is it going to take for you to have to say yes to that? So that's a hard negotiation. I think the escrow people use because it's sort of that neutral company in the middle, and Iron Mountain is just going to sit there and not give access to anybody. So it runs like sort of the continuum of what's it worth to you.
Now, a good trick to use if you have technical resources on the customer side is each milestone delivery, instead of them delivering the actual compiled code to you and you test that, they deliver source code to you. And someone on your side actually does the build and compile and then test from that. And then you know what you have is exactly what you've been tested and accepted.
So I want to go back to this, when the deliverable is handed in, if there's been some other agreement about this needs to comply with HIPAA or needs to comply with some other regulation, how does the checking of that work?
Really, at the very start, you should hire a vendor that has experience in the particular regulations that you're worried about. So if you're worried about HIPAA compliance, then you should hire a vendor who has some experience, at least, depending on the size of the project, in HIPAA. that's the best way to ensure that you have some compliance on that back end. There are no ways to pass a test if you're HIPAA compliant. There's no certification that protects you from that, and so it's really the expertise of the vendor, and on your side, validating you're getting what you need to hire professionals who have that expertise. In other instances, like PCI compliance for e-commerce, there's actually testing you can pay for, and they come from the outside, go to your public storefront site, and they test it against PCI compliance. And that doesn't completely resolve you of any issues that could happen with the data, but it does draw a good line that basically says, you know, I met this minimum required standard to be PCI compliant. And a lot of the credit card agencies and that sort of thing require that now. So you can't hook to their credit card processing system unless your system has passed HIPAA compliance. Now, Texas actually has a state law where you can get HIPAA certified, and it protects you from some issues with legal issues within the states. It basically proves I did some due diligence on my software and systems to make myself HIPAA compliant, but no other states have that. So it's just going to take a while before the customers have something they can say, I did this, therefore I did everything you could reasonably do to keep somebody from breaking in or stealing the data.
So Michael, Charlotte's question about I Imagine before brings up another issue, right, which is I've just paid sometimes hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars for this new crown jewel that I'm going to deploy in my business. Do I have a backup for that? What if the servers get hit by a hurricane that that's being stored at? What else do I need to do to make sure that I'm ready to operate?
Well, the documentation I talked about that you should get with your software is not just the source code documentation. Source code documentations are the instructions within the software code that says this piece of the software does this and this piece does this. That helps new developers come in and work on it. But you also need an overall systems documentation that says this is what the software does, this is what it requires to put it in production, and then you should have, and sometimes the software vendors are not the companies to supply this. You need more of an IT consultant to come in and help with that. This is what it takes to run the software in production, and here's my plan to recover from disaster. And so a disaster recovery plan is basically a plan you put in place to say if the server that my software runs on, for instance, if it were to disappear, the building burnt down it was in, how would I recover from that? That's a disaster recovery plan. The important thing to know about a disaster recovery plan is they're absolutely worthless if they've never been tested. So you can have the smartest IT guy in the world create your disaster recovery plan. If that's not tested periodically, you have no idea if it would work. And if that server disappears because of a hurricane, you don't know you can recover from that. So you should have a good disaster recovery plan in place. If you're dealing with a software company that's used to also helping with production operations, they can help you with that. Sometimes software vendors are just purely software vendors, and you need an IT services to actually run it in production, and so you need some expertise there. That's where on the customer side, you need to provide that expertise, and if it's a sufficiently large project, you need to hire either in-house or a third-party professional project manager who's dealt with engineering and managing software projects before, so they can represent you and make sure that you get what you paid for and that you're ready to go into production and can safely operate.
What does happen in the McLean vendor situation? What happens if the vendor does go out of business? If you're working with a company that folds or gets absorbed and you're unclear, what happens if that relationship just terminates?
Well, if you don't have the source code and they just disappear, you're out of luck, right? Software actually can be what's called decompiled. You can reverse it out, but the cost of doing that is astronomical because it's not designed to do that. So if you don't have possession of source code and they literally go out of business and close the doors and nobody answers the phone, you're in a tight situation. Legally, you can go after them, but if they're broke, if the owners are broke, or if they had the proper legal protections set up, they didn't do anything illegal, they just, unfortunately went out of business, there's not much you can do about that. So that's why you need to have, as your deliverables, the things you need to carry on if that vendor disappears, or to switch to a new vendor if you choose to do so.
Well, thanks everybody for coming today. If you have any questions that you think of on the drive home or after this, give Michael, give Eleanor a call. You have their contact information. This is exactly the same conversation that Michael and Eleanor would have had if you guys weren't here. This is what they talk about at lunch. And so if you ever have ideas you want to just bounce off them, call them. This conversation for them will continue, and I'm sure it will for you as well. So thanks so much, everybody.